Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my in-depth review of the Nikon Z7, a full-frame mirrorless camera with 45 megapixels, 4K video, built-in stabilization, and 9 frames per second shooting. In this video, I'll delve into the body design, the new lens mount, auto and manual focus, burst shooting, wireless capabilities, and the movie mode. It's an in-depth video packed with demos and analysis, so grab yourself a drink, sit back, and take it all in. To make it easier to dip in and out of or find exactly what you're looking for, I've also provided time-stamped contents in the comments below. Before I start though, can I ask a quick favour? If you like my videos and haven't already subscribed, please give me a follow. You'll be the first to see my latest reviews and tutorials, and you'll also really help my channel to grow. Thank you very much, and now on with the video. The Z7 is immediately recognisable as a Nikon camera, inheriting much of the DNA of its traditional DSLR siblings. The buttons, dials and labelling, not to mention the menus, will be familiar to any Nikon owner, but are equally welcoming to newcomers. The grip and thumb rest allow you to hold the body confidently and comfortably, and everything feels solid and well built with weather sealing to match the D850. Place it next to a D850 and it's obviously much smaller and lighter, as much as half the weight when an equivalent lens is fitted, but it remains very comfortable in your hands. In terms of buttons and controls on the rear, the Z7 will be familiar to most Nikon DSLR owners, and I'm pleased that Nikon has equipped the Z7 with some decent sized buttons that feel good as you push them. They're quite tactile. That said, I do wish one of the manufacturers of a high-end mirrorless camera would take the opportunity to equip their camera with backlit buttons, as indeed Nikon does on a lot of its higher end DSLRs. It really helps for night photography and long exposures. You'll also notice, if you're familiar with the DSLRs, that the row of buttons that's normally to the left of the screen, well, there's no room for them anymore, so they've been redistributed around the body's surface. In particular, this little section of 4 buttons here with the magnify and shrink buttons looks a little crowded to me, but I didn't really press them accidentally when I was using the camera. There's also a broad degree of customization available in the controls menu. You can customize the eye menu, you can put whatever you want on this. You can also customize a lot of the buttons. Let's have a look at what you can do here. Go through all these different options of buttons that you can reconfigure. You can also customize the red record movie button on the top, because if you press it when you're in a normal shooting mode, it won't actually start recording video. You have to switch this collar first to movie. So when you're shooting stills, you could use that red button for something else. And finally, I want to show you that the Nikon Z lenses, the native Z lenses, have got a customizable control ring. This by default operates the manual focusing, but you can alternatively have it adjust the aperture or the exposure compensation, although when I tried that, it did feel a little bit oversensitive and adjusted those values a little bit too quickly. I should also mention that you cannot change the speed at which the manual focusing ring works or the direction either. It's Nikon's way or the highway. On the top of the camera, you'll find an OLED information screen. Now, this isn't backlit because it already glows, and it is quite visible in bright conditions and dim ones too. You can see the aperture value adjusting there on the upper right side, and the shutter speed on the top left side there with the ISO value, shots remaining, battery life, and exposure mode. I should, however, say that when you switch it off, nothing appears anymore, whereas on some Nikon DSLRs or older models you would actually see the number of shots remaining. I would really like to see that still displayed when the camera is powered off, or maybe the battery life at a glance. Nikon's equipped the Z7 with a generously sized 3.2-inch screen. That's bigger than the average 3-inch screens you find on a lot of cameras, and nicely the shape is 3x2, so it matches the native shape of the sensor. You can angle the screen up by 90 degrees, which is great if you're filming at low heights, or you can angle it down by about 45 degrees, which is great when you're shooting over the heads of crowds. What you can't do with this screen though is flip it out to the side. So if you're interested in using the Z7 for vlogging, well, you're out of luck, or at least you're out of luck if you want to be able to view the screen while you film. If you do want to view the screen while you film, you'll need to mount something, say on the hot shoe, and connect it to the HDMI port, something like an Atomos Ninja 5, which would also have the benefit of recording the 10-bit output from the Z7. And of course, you can twist that screen round to face you. While composing with the Z7, you can overlay various pieces of information on the screen. I've enabled an alignment grid here for starters because I find them very, very useful. If you press the disk button up here, you can get a live histogram, Press it again, you get a dual axing leveling gauge. Now you get an information view if you'd prefer to see your shooting information, and this is all touch sensitive as well. If I press the I button down here, I can actually go through all of these options as I wish, and you can do that also by pressing the I button. Press disp again and we get a more detailed view here. Press it once more, I go back to a cleaner view. Enter playback, and you can use the touch screen to swipe between pictures. You can also pinch to zoom in and scroll around the picture. It's all pretty responsive. And there's also a wealth of shooting information you can view in playback. Now this is completely configurable in the menus. By default it only shows you a couple of pages, but I've gone into those menus and enabled a lot more. And like other Nikon cameras, you just push up and down to access those pages. So here we see a view which has a brightness histogram, a satellite icon indicating that I did have the camera connected to my phone over Bluetooth when I took this, so I will have GPS coordinates. And there they are, the actual coordinates of that image. Pretty neat, huh? All happens seamlessly if you want. More advanced shooting details if you require, the type of lens you used, and then this view here with the brightness and RGB histograms. This view would also be showing flashing highlights if they are saturated, which they weren't on this particular picture. And back to the clean view again. Now I shot this image in RAW and JPEG mode, and the Z7 actually allows you to process RAW files within the camera. It's not in the playback menu as you might think, it's actually in the retouch menu. There it is, NEF RAW processing. So I'm going to select this image here. Okay. And now you can see the different options that I can adjust after the event. So it's really handy to take raw files and then be able to change things like the white balance or one of the picture styles afterwards and create new versions of that file if you like, and also output it at whatever quality you would like. As a mirrorless camera, Nikon of course fitted the Z7 with an electronic viewfinder, and it's one of the best panels on the market. Quad VGA 1280 by 960 pixels with 0.8 times magnification. So this is going to deliver a bigger view than most viewfinders on DSLRs. And of course, as an electronic viewfinder, you can play back images through there, zoom in, use focusing assistance, you can preview effects. I mean, I really do prefer electronic viewfinders to optical ones now, but Nikon has a lot of traditional DSLR owners to convert with its technology. I don't think it'll have too many problems here. There's also a sensor at the top, which as you can see can be set to switch between the viewfinder and the screen automatically. I should say before moving on that sometimes this sensor seemed to actually think that I was looking through the viewfinder all the time. I think if a little bit of dust gets on there or perhaps a water droplet, you may experience some issues with that, but just wipe it off and you should be fine. And to be fair, that's something that affects other electronic viewfinders too. Behind two rubber flaps on the side of the body, you've got the Z7's ports. We've got a microphone and headphone jack here, standard 3.5mm jacks. We have a connector here for an optional cabled remote, an HDMI port, and here a USB-C port. The Z7 can be charged internally over USB-C, and Nikon generously includes a USB-C charger with the Z7. It also includes an external AC battery charger if you prefer to charge the battery outside the camera. I should also say that I successfully recharged the Z7 over USB-C using the USB-C charger for my Apple MacBook Pro 13-inch. That's the Touch Bar Edition 2018 model. You can't, however, power the camera over USB-C, only charge it over USB-C. You can also use the USB-C port though for connecting it to your computer to transfer images and movies. In my test, however, I noticed that it was quite a bit slower than using a separate XQD card reader. So if time is of the essence, get yourself a decent XQD card reader. The Z7 is powered by a new version of the ENEL15 pack. This now on Model B. You need the Model B version if you want to charge it over USB in camera. You can use the older packs in the Z7, but you won't get quite as long battery life and you won't be able to charge them over USB. Now Nikon quotes about 330 shots on a single charge, which sounds disappointing initially because it's about half that quoted by Sony, but like so many quotes, you can in fact get more in practice. I found on one session, and this wasn't just all continuous shooting, although there were a few bursts in there, I got well over 500 shots and still had battery life remaining. So it depends how you use the camera. In terms of video, I also filmed 4 30-minute 4K clips on a full charge and still had enough for 10 minutes afterwards. So that's 2 hours and 10 minutes worth of 4K on a single charge, which actually isn't too bad. Remember the Fujifilm X-T3, which also quotes about 300 shots per charge. It only managed just over 1 hour's worth of 4K on a single battery. On the right hand side of the body, you'll find the Z7's arguably most controversial feature, a single memory card slot, and an XQD card slot at that. This is a Sony 64GB XQD card. Now, what can I say? This could or could not be a deal breaker for you. Only you can decide. I can't tell you. Now, if you do have dual memory card slots, you do have that redundancy, which the Z7 and the Canon EOS R do not have. And it is a shame because Fujifilm have twin slots, so does Olympus, so does Panasonic, so does Sony. It really is just Nikon and Canon with their first full-frame mirrorless cameras. And Nikon's also gone for a format which is really quite expensive compared to SD cards. Of course, you may already have an XQD or you may not mind. Now, XQD does have a couple of benefits over SD cards. First of all, it's faster, typically faster, although in the case of the Z7, the buffer is not really big enough to make use of the card speed. You're not really going to be pushing this card. But one of the benefits you will get from it, and this is important since it only has one card slot, is that it is a more robust format than SD. It should last longer. It should be less susceptible to damage. But once again, it's only something you can decide if one slot is enough for you. It has one slot. It says QD. Tell me what you think in the comments. Nikon sensibly resisted reusing the aging f-mount from its SLRs and instead developed the new Z-mount for the best optical performance. Its 55mm inner diameter is wider than rivals and the 16mm flange distance shorter than most too, which makes it easier to develop high-performance wide-angle or large aperture lenses. Now, it's not impossible for narrower or deeper mounts to achieve this, it's just harder. At launch, there's 3 native Z-mount lenses. Most people will buy the Z7 in a kit with the Z24 to 70mm f4 lens, which I have mounted here. It really makes sense to buy this lens in a kit with the Z7 because Nikon will do you a really good price on it compared to buying it separately later. A couple of things to note on it. Here, the manual focusing ring can be configured to adjust the aperture exposure compensation. I'll show you that later on in the video. And secondly, notice the zoom ring here in its retracted position. You actually have to twist it before you can start using it to the 24mm mark here, and then extending to 70mm there. And then when you finish shooting, you twist it again, and the barrel retracts to its shortest position for transportation. The first prime lens to be available for the system is the 35mm f1.8, which I have mounted here. 35mm, of course, is that classic focal length for street photography, but it's also great for general purpose use, and that f1.8 focal ratio allows you to effectively blur the backgrounds. Available shortly after launch is the 50mm f1.8 prime, but the first exotic lens to really exploit the mount, the 58mm f0.95 Noct, won't arrive until 2019. Nikon's roadmap promises 9 new lenses by the end of 2020, including more f1.8 primes and a pair of ultra-wide zooms. The initial lenses are a sensible start to the system, but I'd have preferred to see at least one exotic lens at launch to illustrate the benefits of the Z-mount from day one. Compare that to Canon, which launched the EOS R with 4 lenses, including a 50mm f1.2 and a 28-70mm f2, both lenses to get really excited about. If you're an existing Nikon DSLR owner, then one of the most important accessories you'll get is this, the FTZ adapter. Indeed, it's available in many of the Z body bundles. This allows you to mount any f-mount lens, such as the AFS 70 to 200mm f4, which I have here. Now, when you mount a recent f-mount lens, the Z series bodies will be able to autofocus them quite effectively. In my tests, I tried about 3 or 4 different f-mount lenses, and they all focused almost as quickly as they would with a DSLR. Not quite as fast, but still certainly very, very usable. And of course, you also get the benefit of autofocusing across the entire frame, which you don't get with a DSLR, at least when using the optical viewfinder. If the lens has its own stabilization, then the body takes care of the roll compensation, leaving the X and Y axis to the optical system inside the lens. But if the lens doesn't have any of its own optical stabilization, then the body takes care of it all, and it really transforms the use of those unstabilized Nikon primes. Not to mention third-party lenses that you can also mount via the adapter. The FTZ adapter actually supports autofocus on 93 old f-mount lenses, and again all of these will enjoy focusing across the entire frame and the benefit of the built-in body-based stabilization. The 3 native lenses at launch also rely on the built-in stabilization, which in my test allowed me to handhold the 24-70mm at 70mm at 1/5 of a second. That's 4 stops slower than I could without stabilization. Stabilization also transforms video shooting, which I'll show you later in the review. Moving on to autofocus, the options are accessed via the I button here. This is where I can see the AF areas. We have pinpoint AF, single point AF, wide area autofocus, small and large, an auto area where the camera attempts to work out for itself what you want to focus on. Now these areas are actually quite a lot smaller than you might think. Single point, you might expect quite a large square, but it's tiny. So I'm going to start with wide area AF on the small size. I'm going to OK that and exit the I menu. And you can see the red focusing square there in the middle of the frame. If I half press the shutter release, you can see it focusing. Now there's a dedicated AF joystick, so I can easily move the AF area. Let's move it to the top right corner, say to here. Pretty quick. And now let's move it over to dash in the bottom left. Easily done. And if you want to return to the middle quickly, you can just press the OK button. Now, of course, the Z7 has a touch screen, so you can alternatively tap to reposition the AF area. This is pretty swift. Now, interestingly, the touchscreen becomes disabled when you're using the viewfinder, so there's no chance of using the touchscreen as a touchpad AF system. Instead, when you're composing through the viewfinder, you'll need to use the AF joystick, but at least that means that your nose isn't going to adjust the AF point by mistake. Now let's have a look at some more of those autofocus options. I'm going to show you the single point AF area now, because it really is pretty tiny. You can see it there. Quite a small square, but you can position it quite precisely. And if you want to check to confirm your focus, you can magnify the view at any point using the magnify button here. Let's have a closer look. Pretty close. I'm quite confident that it's in focus there. If you prefer, you can manually focus. And you can also use this I menu with the touch interface, so I'm going to do that now. So we've got AFS selected there. I'm going to go for manual focus. And I have peaking enabled to help me know when the subject is in focus. You can see it there on the background. And now on dash again in the foreground. Now, you may not be able to tell that easily in this full view whether your subject is in focus. So again, you can zoom in on them. And now, there we go. That's much easier to see. And peaking remains active on this magnified view as well. Okay, now let's check the autofocus tracking. To do this, I'm going to set it to AF continuous and change the area to wide, the full area. And now when I press OK, you'll see a target in the middle of the screen. It's trying to identify what I want to track. I'm going to give it the silver top to this bottle. I'm going to half press the shutter release to confirm. Let's make sure it can actually focus on it. Okay, and now when I move it around the frame, you can see that target following it. Now, whether the camera can actually then drive the lens to keep it in focus is another matter. I found sort of varying degrees of success depending on the lens, the subject and everything else, but at least you can see the software behind the scenes is doing a pretty good job at tracking that across the frame. And that also applies for face detection, if you like. In terms of burst shooting, the Z7 offers two continuous high-speed modes, both with continuous autofocus. There's the normal high-speed mode at 5.5 frames per second and so-called live view between the frames, although in practice it doesn't give that much feedback, and a high extended mode which shoots at the top speed of 9 frames per second. But beware, the buffer is actually relatively small, so you could run out of frames before your action has actually fully taken place. To demonstrate that, I have the Z7 here set to its continuous high extended mode, so 9 frames per second. I have the quality set just to JPEG, fine, but not fine star, so just fine. Let's hear how that sounds. So those last 5 frames were at a slower speed. At the fastest speed I was typically getting between 25 and 30 frames. It is shooting at 9 frames per second with continuous AF, but only between 25 and 30 frames in JPEG mode. In my tests when I set it to RAW, to 12-bit RAW, whether compressed or uncompressed, that buffer reduced to around 20 to 22 frames, and when I was set to 14-bit RAW it actually went below 20 frames, sort of 18, 19 frames in total, and at that point it didn't slow down, it just stopped recording altogether. So in practice you're actually looking at only being able to capture about 2 seconds worth of action at the top speed in RAW, or up to about 3 seconds in JPEG, and that means you have to be pretty careful about when you actually fully depress that shutter when action is taking place. If you're shooting, say, a cyclist coming towards you, well, you better wait until they're actually pretty close before you start shooting, because you may run out of frames before their action's taken place. Well, that's the theory. How about the actual practice? Now, I took the Z7 out and shot various action sequences, first of all with my friends Ben and Nick, who were cycling towards me in different situations, and also trying out the burst shooting and the autofocus with Brighton's seagull population. Let's see how the Z7 fared. The Nikon Z7 will shoot at up to 9 frames per second with autofocus, and you're looking at a burst I captured in this mode of Ben cycling towards me with a 24-70 at 70mm f4 in the cropped DX mode. In this sequence of 29 images, only 12 or so are in sharp focus, with most of the second half looking soft. At 9 frames per second there's also no live update between frames, making it much harder to follow unpredictable motion. Here's another example at 9 frames per second, this time with Nick on the velodrome using the 24-70 at 70mm f4 in FX mode. In this sequence of 21 frames I enjoyed a higher hit rate than the previous session, with roughly 3/4 in sharp focus, although the closest one still struggled. Revealingly, this is a task where Sony's Mark III full-frame bodies, not to mention Nikon's DSLRs, perform much more confidently. Drop the speed to 5.5 frames per second and you'll enjoy much greater success with the Z7 and moving subjects. In this sequence of 24 frames, all but the first couple of images are sharp, although while the Z7 claims to offer live view between frames at this speed, there's not actually that much feedback, again making it hard to follow unpredictable subjects. Speaking of unpredictable subjects, Brighton's seagulls presented a big challenge for the Z7, whether it was birds suddenly entering the frame or approaching from a distance in flight. Typically, I'd only managed to fire off 3 or 4 frames for each pass, and while I grabbed a handful of keepers, I sadly had more frames that were out of focus than those that were sharp. Again, this is an area where Sony's latest full-frame bodies excel, delivering an almost flawless hit rate in my tests, and lest we forget, again a task where Nikon's high-end DSLRs also perform impeccably. In short, I'd say while the Z7 is capable of capturing modest action and wildlife in some situations, it's not an area where the camera will be performing at its best. Again, it's remarkably good for a version 1 product and way ahead of what Nikon achieved in live view on its previous DSLRs, but if you're a serious sports or wildlife shooter, then you'll be much better off with a Sony mirrorless or a Nikon DSLR. Okay, now I'm going to talk about shooting modes. I'm in aperture priority indicated by the A in the top left corner here, but I'm going to go for the display view that shows just shooting information on the back to make this clearer. Now in aperture priority I can use the front control dial to adjust the aperture. You can see that there. You'll notice that the shutter speed here is not changing as you would expect. That's because it's already at the minimum value for the 35mm lens that I've got attached here in auto ISO. So it's going, you don't really want to be using that lens below a 40th of a second, so I'm only going to adjust the sensitivity to match the aperture. I'm going to talk more about auto ISO in a moment, and also you can adjust these things by touch if you prefer. But I actually quite like using the physical dials. Now I'm going to take the camera into manual exposure mode here. Again, I use the front dial to adjust the aperture, and I use the rear dial here to adjust the shutter speed. So let's see what is the longest selectable shutter speed, because I'm really into long exposure photography, and you might be too. If this is a technique you'd like to learn more about, check out my tutorial at YouTube. It'll tell you everything you need to know. Now we're at 30 seconds. Now beyond 30 seconds we've got the bulb mode, and this is fairly arbitrary for many digital cameras. It's really disappointing because there's no reason why it should stop at 30 seconds. It's just a figure that somebody decided at some point. Beyond this you're in bulb, which keeps the shutter open for as long as you have the shutter release held. Beyond this you have time. Now this opens the shutter once with one press and closes it with another, and you can trigger it with the self timer, so you can almost do it hands-free, but when you come to close it I would put a hat or a cover over the front of the lens so you don't record any wobbling. Now I'm just going to show you something in the time mode now. If I just press the button to start it, you'll notice that the shutter is now open, but there is absolutely no indication of how many seconds it has been open for, which is a bit of a shame. I would like to see a little counter here, and then when I press it again to exit it, there was no guidance there. Now it did say time on the top display, but that's all. Now, at this point, I should say that there are a couple of camera brands that do go beyond 30 seconds in the manual mode. Olympus and Panasonic commonly go up to 60 seconds, but Fujifilm has taken the lead here, and you can just keep turning this dial beyond 30 seconds. It goes to 60 seconds, then to 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, and 15 minutes, all immediately accessible from just varying the shutter speed dial, which I really think is the way forward. I wish more cameras did this. Now let's take a look at Auto ISO as promised. Now there is a dedicated ISO button on the top of the body, and if I push it while turning the front dial I can switch it between Auto and Manual ISO. Now interestingly, when it's on Auto ISO you can still adjust the ISO using this dial here. Now what I'm actually setting here is the minimum value that I want it to go to. So that's actually quite fun, although when you first pick up the camera you might think you're manually selecting the ISO here. You're not. You're still in Auto ISO. You're just selecting the minimum value. But the Auto ISO settings are pretty advanced on this camera, and I'm going to show you those right now. So into the photo shooting menu and ISO sensitivity settings. And here are the Auto ISO sensitivity controls. Now we can of course set the maximum sensitivity. That's normal. You saw the minimum sensitivity a moment ago, but this is where it starts to get really clever. The minimum shutter speed here, you can actually set it manually, or you can set it to auto, and what auto does is it takes the focal length into account. You saw that it had chosen a 40th of a second before because it thinks that that's what I need to handhold that 35mm lens that I've got attached. Now unfortunately it doesn't take vibration reduction into account. You should probably be able to handhold that lens a little bit slower than that, even with this high resolution. But what you can do, and I really like this, you know how in situations, say I'm using this lens, it's a 35mm lens, the lighting conditions are dim as it is here, so it's selecting a minimum shutter speed of a 40th of a second. Now that's fine for a static subject, but of a person, well, they could be moving around. So what I can do is actually say, look, I want you to actually use a faster shutter speed than you think I need at this point. So I'm going to choose that, and let's see what it's done to that minimum value. Of course, I have to do something more sensible with it here. Put it into aperture priority, and you'll see now that that minimum shutter speed is an 80th of a second, twice as fast as before. And that's what each of these notches is worth. So if I do it on the fastest setting of all, you'll see that the minimum shutter speed is now 160th of a second. It will not go below that. And conversely, we can do that in the opposite direction. where if you're shooting a static subject and you're thinking, well, look, you know, I reckon I can handhold this at a slower shutter speed, or maybe I'm on a tripod and I want better quality, I don't want it to increase the ISO too much, well, we can go slower. That's 1 stop, as we can guess, 2 stops slower, so I'll just OK that and see what it's done. And again, you can see that minimum shutter speed there has now gone down to 1/10 of a second. You saw that the touchscreen became active there. If you don't like that, you can switch it off. Like all high-end Nikon cameras, there's a wealth of shooting options. If you're into bracketing, maybe for a bit of HDR, you can have up to 9 frames, and they can be up to 3 EV apart, although you see it drops to 5 frames then. We also have multiple exposures, in-camera HDR if you'd prefer the camera to look after that for you. In an interval timer, now this is something which Sony famously removed from its cameras when it took off the Play Memories apps, so I'm really pleased to see that it's still a standard feature on the Nikon camera, as indeed it should be on any camera of this class. We also have time-lapse movies. This is where you can set the output quality, but you can also set things like obviously the interval and the total shooting time. You'll notice here an option for silent photography. This uses the electronic shutter, which I'll show you in just a moment. Actually, while I'm in the menus, notice that you can actually use the touchscreen to scroll through them all as well if you prefer. So now onto focus shift shooting. You can see I can use my thumb quite effectively for that with the touchscreen. This allows you to adjust the focus. It's a macro technique. It allows you to adjust the focus in very fine increments, and it takes a bunch of pictures at slightly different focusing distances. And the idea is that you stack these in software later to extend the depth of field. To test focus shift shooting, here is a picture that Thomas, who tests all the Nikon lenses for Camera Labs, took with an adapted Tamron 90mm macro lens. Here it is at f5.6, and now here's a version at f22 that's fully closed. But the big problem with shooting at f22 is that you are really in the realms of diffraction. So the trick is to use a more diffraction-friendly aperture, in this case f8, and to take multiple images, in this case about 30, that have been entered into Helicon Focus, which is focus stacking software, and this is the final result. You can see it's maintained a decent degree of sharpness, there's no diffraction, and you've got that very broad depth of field from front to back. And finally, we have the silent photography option. Now, before I turn that on, let's have a listen to the standard mechanical shutter. Okay, now this is going to sound a bit corny because it's going to be completely silent. This is the fully electronic shutter. It is, as you'd expect, completely silent. Now, there are some caveats to using the electronic shutter. As with all cameras, it's fairly susceptible to rolling shutter skewing artifacts. To demonstrate the effect of the electronic shutter in action, here's a bunch of photos that I took while panning the camera from left to right. First of all, with mechanical shutter. And notice these pillars. Notice how they're completely vertical, which is what you'd expect them to look like. But now when I switch over to the electronic shutter, watch what happens. See how they're now all sloping to the side? Believe me, that is not how they should look. Here they are again. Now, this is because of skewing rolling shutter artifacts. The problem is that the camera sensor is taking time to read from top to bottom, during which time you've moved the camera, so it renders these straight lines as diagonals, which obviously isn't very attractive. So use the electronic shutter with caution. However, there is a third shutter mode that I would like to show you. This isn't in the photo shooting menu. This is actually in the custom setting menu. If I go to shooting display, you can see here an option for electronic front curtain shutter, which is off by default. So by default, the camera uses a fully mechanical shutter. Now, if I switch this on, and then I'm going to also go back to this menu and make sure that the silent mode is off. Let's have a listen to that. Now, what's happening here is the camera is using an electronic curtain for the opening of the shutter, but a physical closing of the curtain for the end. Now, this actually avoids those artifacts that we saw with the skewing, but it also avoids a problem called shutter shock, where at certain shutter speeds, vibrations within the camera can actually blur the image a little. Now, I didn't notice that in my test, but if you do, you may want to use the electronic front curtain. However, there is one caveat that you have to be aware of. Watch this maximum shutter speed. As it goes up, you will see that it goes no further than 0.002 of a second. If I go back and turn that option off, we can see that the Z7 can in fact access much faster shutter speeds of 8,000th of a second. So if you are using electronic front curtain, be aware that your maximum shutter speed is 2,000th of a second, and under some situations you might see some other artifacts, especially under artificial light. Once again, for me, I use the mechanical shutter for all my tests. There's no artifacts to worry about. I get the top shutter speed and I didn't notice any shutter shocks, so your mileage may vary. Well, I reckon that was enough for one video, so I'm going to stop now and start afresh in part 2, where I'll take an in-depth look at the Z7's image quality, including resolution, noise, dynamic range, and how it compares to the D850 and Sony a7R II. I'll also show you everything you need to know about the movie mode, as well as the wireless snapbridge capabilities. If you found this review useful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you really like it, you can support my work by checking prices or treating me to a coffee using the links below. If you're into photography without post-processing, check out my in-camera book, which tells the story behind 100 of my favourite travel photos, all JPEGs out of camera with no Photoshop or Lightroom. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter @CameraLabs. Thanks for watching, and see you in part 2 of my in-depth Nikon Z7 review.